Good morning. Welcome to the Annual Business Outlook Forum 2021, Realizing Opportunities and Challenges Ahead, the first hybrid event organized by the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'm Kerry, and I will be your host for the forum. Firstly, I would like to thank our sponsors and partners who have made this session possible. Our preferred partner, Federal Express, strategic partner, JP Morgan Private Bank, supporting organisation Deloitte. I would also like to say a special thank you to our council members and distinguished guests in the audience, as well as everyone who is watching the simulcast online. Our president sends his apologies for not attending the forum as he's flying back from Shanghai today. Without further ado, I would like to invite our Vice President of the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Kwa Boon Wee, to say a few words to kick off the forum. VP Kwa, please.
Distinguished speakers, fellow council members, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the SCCCI Annual Business Outlook Forum. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be here instead of being on yet another Zoom call. It has been a tradition for the Chamber to start the new year by organizing this event, and we're very happy to continue this into 2021, albeit in a hybrid form. I'm really pleased to see such strong participation, both from those who are here in presence as well as those online. Let's make good use of this opportunity to take stock of the economic outlook for the year and get valuable insights from the speakers here today. The ultimate understatement is to say that 2020 was a very challenging year for business. There was serious disruption to economic and business activities due to COVID-19. Singapore's economy contracted by 5.8%. Thankfully, the first batch of vaccines have arrived in Singapore and vaccinations have begun, though there is still uncertainty over how the coronavirus itself will evolve. Our government has forecast that the Singapore economy will grow by 4% to 6% this year. However, I think we all know that recovery will be uneven across sectors. Interestingly, based on our own Chamber's business survey last year, companies indicated that they expect their businesses will recover to pre-COVID-19 levels only towards the end of this year or even 2022. Our government has really gone all out to support our companies and our workers, to help companies cope with the pandemic and also to prevent large-scale job losses. 5 rounds of budget measures were rolled out, totaling close to $100 billion. Next month, our finance minister will announce the 2021 budget. As the economy remains weak, we do hope that there will be some budget measures to boost the economy and help businesses, including some that remain very hard hit by the pandemic. That said, governments can only do so much. Our challenges as businesses and SMEs will remain the need to be resourceful and nimble to adjust and adapt to the constantly evolving business environment. I think we can all relate to how COVID-19 has accelerated existing shifts in the global production and supply chain. While it has hurt existing businesses, new opportunities have emerged. As business people, spotting and seizing such opportunities is an important aspect of our lives. Rapid technological advancement will also have a profound impact on businesses. All of us can relate to how technology has impacted business change this past year in areas like communications, retail, and financial services. The pace of disruption of many existing sectors will no doubt continue to accelerate, sometimes rather uncomfortably so. In areas like agriculture and education, we are also going to see that rapid change, and this is likely to be only the start of the journey. Companies need to embrace key trends and shifts and respond accordingly. Responding with strategies to cope with this new reality will enable us to prosper moving ahead. Waiting for business recovery without adjusting for future realities will be a mistake. On that note, I'm sure you don't want to hear me drone on all morning. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers today who will be sharing with us on the economic and business outlook for the year, as well as talk about some potential investment opportunities. I urge all of you to participate actively. I'd like to also just conclude by thanking our partners again, FedEx, JP Morgan, and Deloitte, for supporting the Chamber to make this initiative possible. I wish everyone a fruitful and productive session this morning. Have a safe and happy New Year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, VP Kwa. Year 2020 has definitely been a challenging year for all of us. From the circuit breaker to the current phase 3, the COVID-19 pandemic pushed our limits to do things that we never thought possible and made us appreciate our friends and family much more. With the new year upon us, will the global economy see a silver lining in 2021? What kind of challenges and opportunities can businesses expect, and when will be a good time to invest? We're honored to have with us today a panel of expert speakers who will share valuable insight on these burning questions and more. All the information and sharing at today's forum are for exchange of views and discussion only. Let me now invite our first speaker, Dr. William Thomas, Director of the Economist Corporate Network in Southeast Asia, who will provide an overview of the world economy and potential of the various markets. An experienced advisor to senior business and government leaders, he helps organizations understand the strategic, operational, and talent implications of geopolitical changes. William, please.
All right, and thank you very much. And it is an honor to be able to join the Chamber today for your event. So thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today. As you'll notice with our speakers today, we're really going to start from the macro level and then work our way down to some specifics. And my job, coming from the Economist Corporate Network, is to provide you that macro level view of the global outlook and the global recovery from COVID-19. So we're going to look at some global issues, but then also bring it back to Asia and specifically to Southeast Asia. I'll start by presenting a little bit of information about where we think the world is going in the next, few years. And then we'll spend some time talking about the elephant in the room, which is the U.S.-China relations. Kind of a timely topic, I think, since we've had a new U.S. president for about 9 hours now. So we'll talk a little bit about what may change there and what impact that could have on this region as well. And then we will look at some specific outlooks focusing primarily on Southeast Asia and some different country expectations that we have in the years to come. So let's start with the big picture, with the global outlook. And interestingly enough, I'm going to have to update a couple of numbers on this slide. So as we look at global GDP growth over 2020, again, no surprise that last year was not a great year. There were a few countries that did manage to do rather well, and in some cases do quite well. And you see China there. I should point out that when we sent the slides over a few days ago to get loaded up on the machine, we were looking at 1.8% GDP growth in China for last year. That has since been updated to about 2.3% for last year. So that would be, if there's one country that has managed to not just maintain but actually grow strongly, one large economy that would be China. Here in Southeast Asia, we looked at about a 3.8% drop in GDP, which means we did beat the global average, which is great. And there actually was one nation within Southeast Asia with positive growth. Anyone know who that is? Vietnam. Thank you. You didn't know there was going to be a quiz, did you? No. But Vietnam, just under 2% growth this year, and they're positioned to continue doing well in 2021. So certainly 2020 was a challenging year, but there will be still some challenges ahead, but also, as you say, some opportunities ahead that folks should try to grab onto. Now, as we recover from this, and all through 2020 we kept talking about what happens when we recover. That recovery is going to be uneven, and it's not going to be the same for everybody. It's not going to go at the same pace for everybody. So most countries around the world are not going to get back to their 2019 levels until next year or even the year after that, even up to 2023. If you look specifically at Southeast Asia, we do see that Indonesia should be able to pull back this year within 2021 and get back to its pre-COVID GDP levels. Singapore, we're looking at, as we heard just a moment ago, either the end of this year or early 2022, we should be able to get back to where we were pre-COVID. So we saw a drop last year here in Singapore of 5.8%. Looking at the predictions, the forecast this year of anywhere from 4 to 6 or even 6.5%. And if we can come out on the high end of that, we'll recover this year. If not, though, it should be into next year. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other factors that affect this. And there's a reason that the recovery is so uneven. Part of it is obviously going to be dependent upon the vaccine rollout and any new strains of virus that come up. Those are certainly going to be factors. But you have to consider other things too, such as where a country's primary revenue driver is. Agriculture is an industry that is going to come back fairly strongly. Tourism is going to be a challenge. So when you see Thailand a little bit farther down the road, that's why. So what I want you to take away from this particular image here, from this particular chart, is not so much where every country is on it, but think about the questions to ask when you're looking at a country. What is their vaccine rollout plan? What are their government plans as far as stimulus packages or spending opportunities? Are they facing any additional lockdowns? Some of us were talking before the event about whether or not Singapore could handle another wave of a virus, of a new variant. That could be a real challenge for us. Going back into lockdown could disrupt this. So, again, the point to take away from this is that there are a lot of different factors that are going to affect a country's recovery. Don't look at every country as a kind of like a cookie cutter approach, like they're all the same, but ask those questions that are relevant to each nation that you're considering and that you're looking at. Something else to look at going forward, something that could hinder some recovery, depending on how it's handled, is the fact that the government stimulus packages to support their societies and their businesses during COVID are far greater than what we saw during the financial crisis of 12 years ago. So governments are putting a lot more money into stimulus right now and have been over the year and will, in many cases, continue to do so into 2021. And at some point, we have to pay for that. So looking ahead, how are governments going to pay for that? Ideally through growth, but as we look beyond 2021, you do see the potential of taxes going up or government spending going down simply to address the debt that the governments have been taking on. So again, something to watch for, not so much in 2021, but looking down the road at the potential for changes in government spending and taxation. So that's kind of the big global picture. One issue that we wanted to spend some time on is U.S.-China relations and what impact that has on Southeast Asia. Like I said, we've had a new U.S. president now for about 9 hours, and so you're probably wondering, hey, what's changed? And the answer is not a lot. Okay? It is going to be off to a bit of a slow start. Let's talk a little bit about that relationship and where we think that's going to go. You will see a different approach to trade from the Biden administration than you saw from the previous administration. And the most recent president preferred to go it alone. In many ways, Mr. Biden is likely to take on a more collective approach to work with allies and work with friends and partners in American competition with China. So the levers that Mr. Biden is pulling are not necessarily going to be the tariff levers. More instead about setting a level playing field, looking for reciprocity, looking for common regulations in both countries, looking for protection of intellectual property and so forth. Not so much the tariff-style approach that you've seen in the last few years. That doesn't mean tariffs are going to go away immediately. Please don't expect that tomorrow morning Mr. Biden is going to get up and suddenly turn all of those off. That's not the way that works. There is going to be a review, and some of those tariffs may remain in place, depending on the industries in question and depending on the effectiveness of those tariffs. So you can certainly expect a different approach going forward. One thing I would like to highlight is that you should not be looking for a reset to 2016. The world has changed since 2016. The relationship between U.S. and China has changed since 2016. And so even though a lot of people coming into the Biden administration were also part of the Obama administration, we're not going to go back to the Obama era relationship with China. We're beyond that at this point. So what does that mean for Southeast Asia? There will be greater interest on the part of the U.S. government in maintaining strong relationships, good relationships here in Southeast Asia. U.S. influence has waned in the last few years, partly due to disengagement and pulling back a bit, partly due to the fact that new trade agreements have come into effect in this region, and the U.S. is not a party to those. So certainly U.S. influence has dropped, and the government is going to be looking to bring that back more through, in many ways, the soft diplomatic style rather than through harsh rhetoric. One thing that I will say that encourages me is Mr. Biden has brought a fellow named Kurt Campbell back into the White House as the director of what's known as the Indo-Pacific Strategy. Mr. Campbell used to be the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific. He was viewed as the author of the Asian Pivot under the Obama administration. He is respected around Asia and in the United States. He's respected by both Republicans and Democrats. If there is a better person to be the White House point man on Asia, I don't know who that would be. So that's a very positive step. So let's take a look then at where we think things are going to go here in the region, not just this year, but in the coming years. Again, as we mentioned earlier, the recovery is going to be very uneven. Different countries are going to be able to recover through this year at a faster pace than others. And so one thing to talk about, and certainly I talk about with my clients, when they talk to their U.S. headquarters and they come up with an Asian strategy, they really need to get down into the details on that and really need to get down to the micro level, because every country is certainly going to be different. And again, some of the factors we talked about earlier that are going to be in play, the vaccine rollout, any additional lockdowns, and so forth. Here in Asia, China certainly came out on top, economically, and again, I would update those numbers just a bit to 2.3% growth last year and a prediction of over 8% growth in 2021. Something that China is going to be looking at this year is some diplomatic efforts. They have taken a hit in their perception around the world and around Asia as well as globally. And so you can anticipate some vaccine diplomacy where they may offer their own vaccine, the Sinovac, to different countries. And we saw that actually this month already with the Chinese foreign minister visiting some countries here in the region. You may also see some debt relief for their BRI projects. Don't be surprised if you see some debt relief offers from China to some of their the BRI nations, the Belt and Road nations. Within particular countries down here, in Thailand, you're likely to see infrastructure programs as a key element of government spending. They know that tourism is going to be a long time coming back, so they're going to focus on other things, trying to expand their manufacturing capabilities, and that's where a lot of the infrastructure spending will be. The protests there have died down, but they're likely to come back as we get into the new year, so the political situation there is still a bit unstable. Here in Singapore, we have a clear plan for vaccine rollout, and the frontline workers are already getting it. There is some expansion into continued expansion into the professional services, but also locally into digital services, the Smart Nation and so forth. And we expect that to continue, and be interesting to see what's in the budget here in just a few weeks. Indonesia, like I said, is the first country in Southeast Asia that's likely to get back to 2019 levels. Their stimulus programs have helped households, and so they expect consumption to continue to rise. They're also spending more on infrastructure. What to watch there would be the omnibus bill that they passed recently that addresses, among other things, worker pay, and we'll see what impact that has on consumption there. Vietnam, we expect them to continue to be strong. For many countries with the China +1 strategy, Vietnam has been the +1. And that's proven useful for them. So their export performance will continue to be strong, and they're expanding their manufacturing capabilities. What to watch there would be continuing economic liberalization, continued restructuring of state-owned enterprises. There is an election coming up there pretty soon, but we don't really expect the transition to create much. The incoming government is likely to want stability, just like everybody else. The last thing that I want to touch on is RCEP and the trade agreements. This is going to certainly help to improve supply chain resilience in the region, and that's something we've all been very concerned about in the last year. That's a trend that is going to continue on into 2021. The agreements have been signed, but they have not been ratified by all the member nations yet. We don't expect that to happen until the end of this year. So 2021 is an opportunity to get ready for RCEP, but it's not going to affect you this year in the sense that it's not, don't expect it to come into practice this year. All right. With that in mind, like I said, taking a look down the road, it certainly is a bumpy road, isn't it? It's not a straight line from here to a perfect recovery. So there are plenty of challenges ahead of us, but over the last year, we've seen that we can handle challenges. I think we're okay with that. The trick is to overcome those challenges and take advantage of all the great new opportunities coming up, and I appreciate the chance to discuss that with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William, for the insightful analysis. Next up, we have Mr. Marcus Ng, Director and Leader of Economics Advisory at Deloitte Southeast Asia. Marcus has over a decade of economic analysis and public policy experience developed in roles with Deloitte Assess Economics, the Australian Treasury, and the Reserve Bank of Australia. He will be giving an analysis of the business outlook, as well as the challenges and opportunities awaiting businesses in Singapore. Over to you, Marcus.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today at the start of a new year, which sees the end of quite a difficult 2020. And as we've said, that's probably an understatement. I'd like to thank the Chamber for inviting me to the annual Business Outlook Forum. As William alluded to just previously, the difficulties of 2020 will probably continue to be a challenge in 2021. No immediate changes right now based on what has happened most recently. As the major economies around the world, such as the US and in Europe, continue to struggle with maintaining growth amidst new waves of the COVID infection, we have fared better in Asia. We're expected to lead the global recovery. And when we look around us in Singapore, we realize that a lot of hard work was done last year to put us in a position to be talking about loosening social restrictions, to be talking about the rollout of a vaccine to the population, and to be able to look towards economic recovery. Before going into some of my thoughts on Singapore's business outlook, I wanted to recap a bit on placing us in context of Southeast Asia. I apologize for not using the Economist's forecast here. I did take the ADB, but it's a bit of an indication, I think. So the growth outlook in the region will be uneven. The major economies, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, they remain subject to lockdown measures to contain the outbreaks, which will put pressure on their outlook. Thailand has had success in containing the pandemic, but with tourism accounting for 1/5 of their economy, its recovery will partly depend on the end of global travel restrictions. Vietnam also experienced some success in managing the pandemic with its early actions on border restrictions. And through the year, the Vietnamese government has been able to accelerate the disbursement of a significant pool of public funding for investments, in particular in transport. So the differences in the fortunes of each country have been largely influenced, I think, by three factors. One is early action that each country has taken to contain the pandemic and the relative effectiveness of their health systems. Two, the relative dependence of each of these economies on external demand. And three, the effectiveness of public support to households and businesses as the lockdown policies were put in place. If we turn to Singapore, since the December growth estimates by the ADB, the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry released their preliminary estimates. We now have heard a few times that last year the economy contracted 5.8%. The consensus economic forecasts for 2021 put us at about growth of 5 to 5.9%. Government estimates 4 to 6%. I think the key thing to think about is the shape of the growth in the coming year. It'll depend on the ongoing infection and watching potential new waves, the effectiveness of our vaccination program, and ongoing fiscal support, as well as the stance of monetary policy, as well as the recovery of business and consumer confidence. While the economy is expected to rebound this year, I think William also mentioned this, it follows a much more significant contraction of activity last year. This means we don't expect the Singapore economy to return to its pre-COVID levels of output until at least 2022. Past crises have shown us that declines in living standards have taken on average more than 2 years to recover in Singapore. So while we expect things to improve, the path to recovery will be gradual, and there are still uncertainties. As I mentioned, much of how this will unfold will continue to depend on the containment of the virus. This chart shows a population-adjusted new confirmed COVID-19 cases, which reveal the extent of the spread of the virus in the past few months. So while the situation in Singapore has been under control for the past quarter, the risk of subsequent waves remain, and at least until our vaccination program is well underway. Now, however, the number of new daily cases in some of our closest neighbors have spiked recently, in Malaysia and Indonesia in particular. These countries have responded with further tightening of social distancing restrictions. There are reports of increases in cases in China, and the subsequent lockdowns in northern cities in provinces of Hebei, Jilin. It shows how the situation can change quickly. So we expect subsequent waves to be better managed, but vigilance will still be needed. So while uncertainty remains, in December we have seen positive signs. The left-hand chart here shows the level of economic policy uncertainty in Singapore. And so while it remains at elevated levels, it has moderated in recent months. At the same time, the right-hand chart shows the Purchasing Managers Index for the economy, and that has recovered from our deeply contractionary position last year. So the moderation in economic policy uncertainty, the improvement in business sentiment, it may indicate our recovery in business appetite to invest. So we can expect a broader recovery in manufacturing in 2021 as the shape of global demand broadens, and tech demand will continue to support the electronics sector. The ICT sector, given stronger demand for digital transformation, that could further accelerate as businesses invest into future growth opportunities. The relocation of Chinese firms, ByteDance and Tencent will add a boost to the sector here as well. So one of the hard-hit sectors, construction, in Singapore, will see a more gradual recovery. The construction sector recorded the highest numbers of job losses in the first 3 quarters of 2020. 1 in 5 of all jobs lost was in construction. It experienced major delays in projects with Changi Airport Terminal 5, as well as the expansion of 2 integrated resorts. And so while private sector construction demand may not yet return, the immediate recovery in this sector is likely to be supported by public sector demand, and that is coming. 2/3 of construction demand this year is expected to come from government, and that's through major projects, the Jurong Region Line, the Cross Island Line, the deep sea sewage, the deep tunnel sewage system out to Tuas. And so in the near term, construction sector will start recovering, but it will be a longer term prospect. It also faces a tight manpower situation. So the recovery so far has been in goods more than in services, as consumers can still make purchases from home while face-to-face activities haven't been able to resume. The outlook for services sector here will be highly uneven, and uneven is something we've heard quite a bit about today. So even if travel bubbles eventuate, the travel and tourism sector will likely stay subdued for some time as international borders remain closed or are reopened very cautiously. So the left-hand chart I have here shows the current level of restrictiveness of government responses across a number of countries that represent Singapore's top tourist sources. So whether it's the top 5 global sources or the top 5 sources in Southeast Asia, you can see that current restrictions remain high, and you can see that it's tightened over the past couple of months. Unsurprisingly, Singapore has been able to relax its restrictions by comparison. If we look to where we expect the air travel industry to go, in July last year, the IATA projected global long-haul passenger traffic to return to pre-COVID levels only in 2024. Short-term or short-haul travel potentially recovering maybe a year earlier in 2023. But more recent data on forward bookings shows that this gradual recovery in global air travel, it may have stalled. So the right-hand chart shows international passenger bookings in the last quarter and in this quarter ahead. So as you can see, demand remains significantly below pre-COVID levels, with total demand down between 71 and 81% last quarter. And demand has even worsened in this quarter, despite vaccine news. So this may push out the expectations for the recovery in air travel. Singapore's trade performance held up a little bit better than expected last year, particularly in some products, specialized machinery and electronics. Total merchandise trade contracted 5.2% last year, generally due to lower oil trade and just generally weaker demand. But trade will improve this year as the global economy reopens. So external-oriented services, such as wholesale trade, transportation, and storage, will likely stage a fuller recovery in 2021. As global demand broadens, hopefully beyond electronics and pandemic-related demand for pharmaceuticals and medical equipment. The strength of our key trading partners will be a key important driver for how it turns out for us. In particular, the strength of the Chinese economy. As we've heard, it's performed one of the best in Asia and probably one of the best globally. And so with Chinese growth having decoupled from the global economy the second half of last year, they've seen steady demand, they've seen strong exports, and this dynamic should continue through 2021, at least most apparently in the first half of 2021, as many other countries struggle from managing the virus. In the US, the results of the US presidential election we know, and importantly, of the recent Senate elections in Georgia, means that the Democrats now have a majority in Congress. So we could see implementation of Biden's $1.9 trillion relief package to boost the US economy. We could see the $2 trillion climate change plan or components of it. And though the relationship between the US and others, including China, remain tense, perhaps we'll see revitalized support for the multilateral trading system, as William mentioned. So these are potential positives for the trade outlook. The signing of RCEP, as mentioned, sets the scene for perhaps longer term effects. But in the short term, we should be relying on how the global economy performs to look at our trade performance. Consumer-facing sectors will be bolstered as the population mobility improves with a gradual easing of restrictions. If we look at the left-hand charts, measures of people movement, if we look at it as a demand proxy, indicate a narrowing, but it's still a substantial gap between current and normal activity. But the resumption of activity is likely to contribute to further improvements in consumer-facing services, education, F&B, health and social services in particular. But soft labor market conditions will continue to weigh on consumer confidence and discretionary spending. The latest unemployment estimates released earlier this month, it revealed that in November, the unemployment rate in Singapore declined for the first time in this year. So a bit of potential positive news that unemployment may be stabilizing. Just to wrap up, there will be a number of risks to watch out for in addition to the continued containment of the virus. First, I've also mentioned, is the elevated unemployment potentially weighing on household demand. Second, There is a risk that credit conditions could tighten as we head up into 2021, as banks become a bit more cognizant of the health of their balance sheets and begin to potentially pare back lending, which could hamper the recovery. Third is whether firms are prepared for a withdrawal or at least a reorientation of public sector support that could be coming in the upcoming budget. So government debt levels, as we've heard, they have increased across the board due to unprecedented stimulus last year. The IMF has estimated that globally, public debt levels would reach 100% of GDP. However, I think reduction of primary deficits, pulling back or targeting more targeted fiscal support, the low interest rates, and the recovery of economic activity could see this stabilize. So COVID-19, it has had a devastating impact on businesses, especially small businesses, on the livelihoods of many, including in the low-income households. I think this gives us reason to be optimistic now when we see some of these positive turning points. We will see a recovery this year, but we need to be realistic that it probably won't be a complete recovery this year. Thank you. I'll pass back to the moderator.
Thank you, Marcus, for the interesting presentation. Our first speaker of the day is Ms. Tianyin Tay, Executive Director and Investment Team Leader of JP Morgan Private Bank. She will share more about the investment opportunities in 2021 and the strategies that businesses should adopt for their portfolios. Based in Singapore, she leads her team in providing discretionary and advisory investment management across equities, fixed income, currencies, and alternative assets to clients in Singapore and Malaysia. Tianyin, please.
Good morning. I'm privileged and honored to be here on behalf of the JP Morgan Private Bank. I have a tough act to follow after my two distinguished speakers, but I will try. So I'll be talking about investment opportunities today. The agenda is fairly simple. I won't touch too much on the macro, but I'll have to kind of set the foundation, because the foundation is what we take from the macro that affects our portfolios is quite important. Followed by three specific ideas and three investment themes. I actually have a lot more, but I promised Professor Annie that I would keep it succinct. I think yes, I have to get used to that. I'm clicking it. All right, so as a backdrop, as we come into this recovery, you've heard that it will vary across the regions, and how it will vary will change the relative outcome and performance of each region. So we believe in 2021 and a bit above, there are 5 key forces that will govern the shape of this recovery. First, the virus. The question is the vaccine vital for us to achieve pre-economic levels, economic normalization? The short answer is not necessarily. In many sectors, as you can see, they've already achieved pre-COVID levels and have gone beyond. We've seen a structural shift, and there'll be a new normal, which I'll touch on later, because it features in our investment themes. Next, on policy and inflation, they're linked. Will the governments continue to be so supportive? You know what's really worked? The fact that the major economies and the governments have come together. They've been really aggressive, more aggressive than many of us expected, but they've been coordinated as well. We don't expect this to stop. We're still in the very, very early stages of our recovery. I don't mean to be a dampener. I'm really excited about the vaccine, but as Marcus and Professor said, so much is unknown about the take-up and the proliferation of it. So bear in mind, the governments will remain accommodative and supportive for as long as necessary. And that brings me to inflation. With governments keeping rates low and for longer, the question of whether prices will rise or fall, well, put it this way, the risk of prices rising too quickly is considerably less than prices staying where they are or falling. So if we were to say with aggressive spending and the growth that we expect and we're positive, then inflation can rise modestly over the next 2 years, but to levels that we've already seen in the past decade. So that's why inflation is not an immediate concern. Next, equity. How can I put more money into the equities when the valuations are so high? Yes, common metrics, not arguing, they look rich, equity valuations. We think they're justified. And the reason we think that is the key reason would be exactly what I said, low growth, a fixed income market, and low yields. It doesn't take that much for equities with decent cash flow yield, decent dividend yield, and earnings yield to look more attractive than fixed income. And we can challenge you that we can show you some areas where the growth is not just single digit, but double digit. And finally, on the dollar, will it weaken further? In short, yes, we think so. And not just for the next year. This is a structural change. You know, the dollar is positioned for broad weakening. If you think about real rates, in real yields term, the US is more negative and it's lower than all the major currencies we track. That includes the Swiss franc, the yen, the euro. Now, because of that, it's positioned to weaken and continue weakening. In fact, against emerging markets, and emerging current markets are always positioned nicely when the US outlook is muted, the dollar. Against currencies with current account surpluses like the renminbi or the Sing dollar, we think that the US dollar can depreciate further. So against this backdrop, what I will say is that we have investment themes, and we also want to help our clients through the uncertainty that lies ahead. So the first one is finding yield. Finding quality income is so important in a low-rate environment. And then on equities, looking at megatrends, trends that were there before already, but now they're accelerated because of the pandemic. And finally, it's not meant to be a dampener, it's actually meant to give a lot of optimism. There is a way to manage these portfolios to stay invested, and that's by understanding and managing volatility. So first, I won't belabor the fact in yield about crumbling cash rates, but what I will say is that with cash projected to erode 5% over the next 3 years, investors and corporates have no choice but to relook at how much cash they're holding. I'm going to suggest two areas that I find very exciting today, close to our heart, in Asia. Asia led the way in the recovery. Asia was the first one as a region, led by China, to open its doors for window. That's why China grabbed much more global trade market share, up to 20%. Yeah, it's fallen to 18, but it's still 15% is the long-term average, the average in 2019. So fixed income, if it's got these great fundamentals and attractive valuations, why is fixed income yielding more than developed markets, particularly in high yield, where you can pick up 2 or 3% more in Asia high yield than US high yield, despite having lower default rates? We see no reason that that should continue, and we see that compressing over time. And that's really about fundamentals and valuations, helped, of course, by a risk-on sentiment because of the global recovery. And that leads me to China, which is the bulk of Asia fixed income. You know, the China, to be specific, I'm talking about the Chinese domestic fixed income market in renminbi. I said earlier about how we think that the renminbi is going to appreciate, so that's a nice addition to appreciation for bondholders. But again, you have a situation where the fixed income market is a net creditor nation, China. Its net external debt to GDP is several times better and healthier than the US. And yet, the yield pickup in China is much higher. So if you look at that chart, just looking at yield and volatility, how much the bond moves in the market, China's a standout with superior yield and better volatility. Look how well China debt held up during the pandemic and the 2018 crisis, during the tensions. Now, the reason for this could be a risk-off sentiment, and last year there was a flight to safe haven assets. Again, this year we don't expect that to continue, and therefore we like very much buying these Chinese bonds in local currency. I'd like next to move on to equities, which I spoke about earlier. Some say this is the most exciting part, but megatrends, it's not meant to be a fancy word. These are durable trends that were there before, but again, pandemic brought it to light, and now everyone and corporates and individuals are looking at it very seriously. There's digital transformation, healthcare, clean energy, and I put in Asia. It's not a mega trend, it's a mega geography maybe. And I realized that there's a bit of a pattern here. I suppose H for healthcare, E for energy, A, Asia, D, that spells head, because they are heading the earnings growth. All of them have that in common. Double digits earnings growth for the next few years, and for good reason. So the question is it priced in? We don't think enough. We think not everything has been priced in. Take digital transformation. The adoption rate of all the critical components, 5G for connectivity and all that data that's going to be there, 5G adoption rate very low. Adoption rate of cloud, 20% by enterprises, it's very low. Most of it was in the last year. And finally, you have artificial intelligence. I don't have to preach to you about how important that is, but I think what I want to stress is that with our new normal of remote everything, less traveling, all these three areas are important, and we're at the early stages. The key thing about this is cybersecurity would be a fantastic example. Do you know that 84% of US corporates who are supposed to be ahead in the cybersecurity awareness game, they say that they're not ready for cyber risks. They're going to rely on artificial intelligence. At that adoption rate, we think it's going to grow exponentially. And I'm going to link over to healthcare, which has a very nice overlap with digital transformation, because when I say healthcare, I'm not talking about the healthcare as we know it. I'm talking about innovation in healthcare. AI, 5G, it's also important. The pandemic has made us realize that tracking, tracing, even diagnosing early and having all this data can help us achieve accuracy and promptness. Not to mention people won't be coming into hospitals as much. Look what happened to our hospitals all over the world. Imagine a system of artificial intelligence and big data that could manage our capacity better and even treat. So that is on the smart healthcare and the digitization. I will shout out on biotech. Now investors, based on the investment profiles, are thinking about what's going to pay off in about 3 to 5 years. And that's why they're willing to pay for growth in innovation. Special shout out to biotechnology with genome, all these names that I've come to have to learn, genomics, gene editing, all to decode the gene to try to treat diseases. Look at biotech, it's trading cheaper than its average, the healthcare average and the S&P, and we think this year will be the catalyst. Next, I will make a mention though. I mentioned a lot of megatrends, but if you just look at the broad indices and buy the ETF, please be wary that sometimes they may not cover these megatrends as focused as you would like. So when you want to invest in these themes, look for securities managers that are aligned to that. Finally, on clean energy, I'm not here like my daughter's preaching to me, 10%, mommy, 10% of the world is breathing clean air. In the past, we had to compromise between production or breathing clean air. Today, we don't. The government is doing tons of spending, and they're all going to go carbon neutral, or at least half of that in 20, 30 years' time. So that's a big government push. The economics make sense. Renewables cost less than coal. Voltaic cells are 82% down. Renewable spending is going to be the highest part of energy spending this year for the first time ever. So because of that, the economics, the governments, and the corporates are paying attention, and investors. Never have I, in the last year and a half, had investors ask me so much, I want my portfolio to be at least 50% sustainable. Otherwise, I don't want to invest in those companies. This is not a mega trend. This is going to be a way of life. And better quality for us too, isn't that great? And finally, on Asia equities, I've talked about the Asia fundamentals. I want to make a mention, and this is close to our heart. We're talking about ASEAN and the improvement. It will be a bumpy ride, Marcus, you're absolutely right. ASEAN is China's biggest trading partner already, which is terribly exciting. China gained global trade share. And with the backdrop of China, I think that Singapore is in a good position because with the RCEP agreement signed and the Singapore being a regional hub, we are positioned to benefit from that. You talked about Thailand, Marcus, and about the vaccine, about tourism, how much it's been affected. And it's true, while we are a bit muted about Thailand versus, say, Singapore in the recovery, we will say that maybe with the vaccine take-up being better than we expect, Thailand could be a surprise beneficiary. Just being positive for Thailand. But Asia is really the bright star, and the flows are the interesting thing. If you look at equity flows, how much equity flows are in emerging market equities, which is 2/3 of it is China, Korea, and Taiwan. The holding is only 7%. The long-term average is 9.2%. So all it is with the risk-on sentiment, it reverts to the longer-term 9%. That's a lot more new flows, 30% more compared to what it is today. And that'll be a great support for the market. And finally, my last point, on volatility. This is crucial to how we manage long-term assets for our clients. We are interested in that long-term compounding nature and staying invested. staying invested is easier than said when you experience a 45% sell down in equities during COVID. Not if you have a diversified portfolio. All of you remember who own investment-grade bonds, how they served as a lovely ballast, selling down a lot less during COVID. Or if you had held a CNH-denominated fixed income, like I mentioned, it gives the investor, not only makes them a bit happier, but or her happier, a smaller buffer to recover. You know, a smaller amount of sell-off, easier to recover and faster to recover. And that's very important. Volatility can also be your friend. In all these corrections, there are two types of things that sell off. One that should and will stay that way, and some that are unfairly sold off. We try to identify those, and that way you can get better entry levels for investments that you like. So thank you very much for your time. In summary, we've covered our key investment themes, which is yield, quality yield, and the good news is that we can find it still in Asia and China. Megatrends, but taking a 3 to 5 year view of an explosive growth. And finally, very importantly, manage and navigate volatility to use it to capitalize and enhance your gains. Thank you very much.
We have now come to the eagerly awaited panel discussion and Q&A session. I would like to invite Professor Annie Koh and our three speakers up here for the panel discussion. Today, we are delighted to have with us Professor Annie Koh, who will be our moderator. Prof. Koh is Professor Emeritus of Finance, practice at Lee Kong Chian School of Business, Singapore Management University. She is a renowned conference speaker, panel moderator, and commentator. And now I will pass the time to Prof. Koh to start the panel discussion. In your good hands, Prof.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Can everyone hear me? First of all, welcome. I think this is a wonderful picture in front of me to have real people. And I've also have approximately over 500, virtual audience. So we want to engage everyone very quickly. I think the whole delivery is amazing, and we did not pay enough credit to the fact that we have not really introduced our panelists. So I'm going to do that, all right? And I think that's absolutely necessary. So without further ado, instead of reading CV, I'm going to start with you, all right, Tianyin? The women must have the last voice and the first voice, all right? So maybe you could kind of tell us your background, because I think a lot of people are interested in who you are individually.
Hi. I think I'll start off with, it was very nostalgic for me coming into this building, which I think is one of the most beautiful buildings in Singapore. Jurong Town Corporation used to be in Singapore, and I started my career at the EDB, Economic Development Board, with the semiconductor developments. So we were here every week for 3 years, just looking for land for some of the top semiconductor companies that we're recommending. But this was nostalgic, indeed. But that's not the key thing about me. I mean, I'm not sure what would interest the audience here, but my background is, after the EDB, I decided to be a high-frequency trading person. After reading a book on a whim and to my father's despair, but I went to Chicago, where they had a flood of hedge funds, and people could trade on the pits. So I went there to try it for a year, and I ended up doing that for about 10 years. And I remember telling Philip Yeo at the time, who was at EDB, and I said, "You think it's crazy, right?" And he went, "No, you've got to follow your dream." And it turned out to be a 10-year career, which I enjoyed tremendously, quantitative finance. And then I came back and joined the private bank in 2011. Been there ever since.
Thank you very much. And, she may not tell you, but I'll tell you, she's actually a Glaxo Wellcome, all right, scholar. So, that passion about health tech, I think you can know where it all comes from. Thank you very much, Tianyin, and welcome. Marcus.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I didn't have to go first on this, because it's always hard to talk about yourself and know what to say. I think the one thing that I have in common is I started out with government as well, albeit in Australia. I spent almost a decade with the federal government in Treasury, and then a little while with the Reserve Bank of Australia. So I come from a perspective of being an observer and a regulator, before now coming into being part of Deloitte, both in Australia and now in Singapore. and looking at Southeast Asia, I now have sort of turned my mind to, okay, what does business care about, and how do we play in the industry? Because sometimes in government you tend to not be as in touch as you probably should be, and so I think from my perspective that doesn't really describe me, but it describes sort of where I come from when I look at these things and have some of these conversations. Yep, I might pass on.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And again, very humble. He worked with the Australian Treasury, and I love the fact that he actually came from government. So there's hope for government officials. You can go to private sector. I'm just pulling your leg. Thank you very much, Marcus. And for you, William.
Okay, well, I will admit I have a somewhat strange background, also public sector, but a slightly different style. So I'm from the United States, in case that wasn't clear, and I spent 21 years as an officer in the United States Air Force. I was a military strategist. About 7 years of that was spent as a political science professor at the United States Air Force Academy. So I was teaching undergraduate courses on political science and American government, as well as military strategy. My introduction to Singapore came in 1993 when one of my students was an RSAF scholar who was over there at the academy for 4 years. And from getting to know him and then following his career subsequently, I learned more and more about Singapore. In 2008, I had the opportunity to come here as a Fulbright scholar and taught at NTU for a semester in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. It was an amazing experience. My PhD is in public policy. So despite what it says on the cover of our publication, I'm actually not a trained economist. I'm more of a geopolitical specialist. And I tend to focus on such things as organizational culture and organizational change. So I brought that to Singapore about 9 years ago. I came here for what I thought would be 2 or 3 years, and that was, 9 years ago. Originally as a consultant, and then I ran my own leadership training and coaching business for a number of years before coming on board with the Economist Corporate Network and getting the opportunity to join this team. So you'll notice, I think, when I speak or when I answer questions, I may have a bit of a talent focus or leadership focus, because frankly, I think that's the basis of everything we do. And I'm going to encourage that very strongly, that we think about that. So I'm again thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Will. So you know now why I wanted that self-introduction, because I think to understand global outlook today, you actually need the integration of disciplines. And it's not enough to think about it from an economic point of view, but the political, social agenda is critical. It's amazing, we have a very active virtual audience, and they're all coming in with lots of questions. But I thought that the priority should be given to our live audience. So, I would like to immediately address questions from the floor. And I know there are a couple of you who have actually told me before we started that I do have burning questions. So maybe I could take 2 questions from the floor before I take the questions from online. Oh yes, Mr. Lau, thank you very much. Can we have a mic given to Mr. Lau, please?
Yeah, hello, morning. We often talk about new normal. Can I ask panel speakers, how do you define new normal when companies are hoping to recover in 2021 to get back to normal?
Thank you, Mr. Lau. What a great opening question, because the new normal will be different from the different perspective of my different panelists. So each one of you will get a step of what does it mean in the new normal from a country level, from a global level. We'll start with you, Will.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. It's interesting, during the last year, so many people have talked about getting back to normal. But I think our definition of normal has been changed, but also perhaps it needs to change. One of the themes that we're emphasizing with our events in the Economist Corporate Network this year is recovery and reinvention. So there are many reasons that you might emerge from this pandemic with your company looking very different than it did going in, for a couple of reasons. Number one, there are so many lessons that we've had the chance to learn over the last year. There are so many things that we had been talking about flexible work arrangements and digital transformation and so on, and we've made a decade's worth of progress in the last year, I think. Let's take those lessons, let's use those lessons, and let's apply those lessons as we go forward. The other reason I think this reinvention opportunity exists is because one of the biggest obstacles to change is, well, people are just uncomfortable with it. Well, you know what? Everybody's already uncomfortable. So let's use this time, let's use this opportunity to reassess what our company's priorities are, what our values are, how we want to work. And if there are things we've always thought about changing, this is the time. Let's take advantage of that. Yeah.
Good response. Marcus?
I think that's a great response, and I think it's hard to sort of think about what else to add. What I might say is I'd like to echo the points in terms of talent and skills that Will started out with in his introduction, which is to say I think a key part of the change here will be reorienting towards those skills that will define sort of demand in the future and will define the way that businesses will want to operate in the future. And I think digital, I think that's definitely one that's on the cards, and we do see sort of governments orienting themselves this way already. If we think about the tech pass that Singapore sort of introduced early this year, which is to encourage tech talent to come here and be based in Singapore. I also think that one of the things that will also come into play is sustainability related sort of concerns. We've seen an unprecedented sort of increase in interest in areas relating to energy and sustainability and social causes. And I think that will sort of define business objectives and will define consumer preferences going forward in our new normal, no matter where we are, no matter which country we're in.
Very nice. And Tianyin?
Yeah, to build on that, the digitization, as I mentioned, I will add that, with 86% of corporates in all developing countries saying that remote working from home or remote locations is going to continue, there's an awareness of that's the quality of life that I want and still being able to be productive. So one thing that occurred to us, whether it's from our clients or what we're hearing in the industry, companies need, initially they spent money to have Zoom and AI, not AI, but just Zoom and anything that's online as a response to the pandemic. Now they're understanding that this is going to be something that they're going to have to strip down, rebuild the digital infrastructure, because if they can't deliver that robust client experience or experience to their suppliers, I think that would be risky. So artificial intelligence will be a huge one, because that could improve economic growth rates. I could double them by 2035 easily.
So if I summarize that question from Mr. Lau, you cannot think about the new normal as your reference of no change. So however uncomfortable, change is imminent. And of course, change towards direction, change towards digitalization, adopt AI, and of course, concentrate on your talent, because that is one of the most critical factors to change. So let me come to the question from the, virtual. We hold on the floor first because people are virtually engaging with us, says, please give me attention. Someone called Max says, what segments of the China market will foresee strong growth? Is it health? Is it digital? Is it infrastructure? It's so broad. All of you seems to have reached the conclusion. We cannot forget China. China is the leading automation of growth. Anybody want to talk about sectors in China? Go on, Tianyin.
I'll give it a go. I'm glad you asked, because China is not just broad China. In short, we would look at areas that would be, we favor domestic consumption, which has surpassed the US for the first time. In China, that would be healthcare, and this is all fueled by domestic consumption. Renewable energy sources, there are companies in China that have 30% of the world's market share in solar energy, distributed solar energy, and we would look at technology. That's what we call the new economy, all kinds of digital transformation.
Very good. Marcus and William, you want to add on?
Perhaps just a brief thing to echo. I think that the reorientation towards more domestic consumption is definitely an area where we need to think about in terms of what China's strategy, even long, medium-term strategy going forward. So I think consumer sectors, sectors that focus on domestic sort of demand, are the areas where we'll be seeing a lot of opportunity and growth.
And Will, you don't have to talk about China. Somebody from online again, very upset. Why is it that in your presentation you did not mention Malaysia at all? It's so close to Singapore. It's got a large part of our bilateral trade. So why was Malaysia not represented in your presentation?
And that is a very fair question. The easy answer I could give is I only had 15 minutes.
Okay. So now you
but having said that,
2 minutes
yes,
now.
no, having said that, no, certainly, what happens with Malaysia obviously has a significant impact here in Singapore. Malaysia is a situation where we were watching and we were seeing progress. And I think they provide an example to all of us of how progress can be derailed, even as this recovery is continuing. So with the most recent movement control order, with some of the political changes there just in the last couple of weeks, this, I think, gives us a strong example to look at of how things can be going forward well, but then can hit a road bump. And you know what? And that's okay, because we're all going to hit road bumps, and we all are going to have to respond to those. And I think it'll be useful to watch and see how Malaysia responds to these changes of the last couple of weeks and how it comes out of those, because there could be some helpful lessons there for other countries that run into similar problems along the way.
Anybody else want to add in your bit about Malaysia? No? Okay, that's fine, because I know someone in the audience who is very passionate about Vietnam. I'm going to ask him to get the microphone. All right, and yes, I know Mr. Edward Ang is all ready for you.
Yeah, Professor, any distinguished speakers, good morning. There are many reports regarding the benefits that Vietnam gets from the US and China trade tensions. My question is, are there other countries in the region that benefited as well, or you think will benefit from this US and China trade tension? That's all. Thank you.
Very good question, Mr. Ang. And of course, Hian Min's hand is up. Okay, you get this one.
Thank you. Well, ASEAN is very near and dear to our hearts. And as I mentioned, it's already China's biggest trading partner. Vietnam has gotten a lot of the attention, as it seems. But essentially, it started from China being the factory of the world to moving a lot of its lower cost production to the neighboring countries. Malaysia benefited beautifully at some point during the year because of rubber and because of what they produced. We talked about the new norm. The new norm is also an awareness that even after the pandemic is resolved, there's an awareness of cleanliness, social distancing, masks, and gloves, and that's where Malaysia can do very well. The overhang, of course, it's the virus containment and the management of it that may go beyond just distribution of the vaccine successfully. If they can get that down pat with their current account surplus, I would say they're in a good position.
Any more to add on? Who else can benefit? Vietnam seems to be the star right now.
I'd say potentially if we look at the skills and the technology and the infrastructure that exist in the countries, which countries are ready to perhaps take up the mantle of some of the supply chain diversification, I would say. We could look to, we've mentioned Thailand, and maybe there's some time before it comes back to strong growth because of tourism, but the automotive sector there is one which does have skills, it has capability. And so perhaps that's one area where it can bring some of this technology and capability to other sort of areas of the manufacturing supply chain that move there. I would also say that if we think more broadly about, we've spoken about RCEP, and we do know, I mean, from William, it probably won't be ratified until the end of the year. But what it positions ASEAN for in the long term is, a stronger position in the global supply chain. And I think that means that a lot of our ASEAN countries can benefit. And that goes to some of the regulatory or some of the changes it makes to sort of the rules of origin, which mean that it's a much easier or less costly to have ASEAN in the supply chain. So there are opportunities, and I think even for Singapore, if we think about us as a hub for investments around the region, there will be flow-on effects from that as well. So I think we look to where skills and infrastructure can be redeployed.
Which then nicely brings me to a question from our audience virtually again. Anonymous attendee, but he was very comfortable with the fact that Mr. William thinks Indonesia will be the first to recover from the pandemic within ASEAN. But isn't the current situation looking very challenging right now? So why are you so buoyant on Indonesia?
Right. So our analysts are looking very positively at Indonesia because of the government's plans over the next year and the coming years, particularly in terms of infrastructure development and spending on infrastructure. So coming back really to the last question, what other countries in Southeast Asia might benefit from the China-U.S. issues, and it's been Vietnam. Indonesia has been attempting to position itself as a manufacturing hub, and that's going to be very helpful within the RCEP structure as well. So that's one reason that we're very positive about them is because of that focused effort on infrastructure development. Yeah.
So as a chairperson's prerogative, I'm going to inject one question right now. We have media, all right, on air as well. Budget Singapore 2021, coming out in 3 weeks' time. Any one of you want to share with us some of your thoughts? What you think will be coming out in the budget, and what would you think should be some of the wish lists of people who are like chambermen, members? What do you think we should be looking for? I think Marcus, they are looking at you first.
Sure, no problem. So I think if there are no sudden spikes in confirmed cases, no hiccups in sort of more recent data or unemployment, I think we can expect a little bit of winding back of some of the existing support measures. And I'm not saying that there won't be support. I'm not saying that it won't be an expansionary budget, but perhaps a much more targeted level of support and a reorientation towards sort of supporting sort of growth and future sort of growth opportunities. The sectors though that are facing sort of more protracted recoveries, aviation, tourism and travel, we should probably expect to see extensions of support for those areas, also with low income households and unemployed. But I would say that it's likely that we will see a more modest budget than the extraordinary amounts that we saw last year, which is not surprising. But it's more about targeting deploying funding in a more targeted way. And I think those sectors that we spoke about in digital, perhaps in green economy, there may be some sort of rethinking about how we focus funding on helping those areas grow.
What about from asset point of view, Kenny?
I agree with that, Marcus. It's going to be not exact thrilling as last year, but so focused to make sure that Singaporeans, because we're not a cheap location, so they have to make sure that people skills redevelop. The amount of grants that are going out to coding, artificial intelligence, that will continue, could even grow, and also educating the elderly on using devices.
Okay, so, and I think, Will, you want to jump in here?
Certainly, yeah. So a point that's come out a couple of times is that there are things we did last year as a response that perhaps we should be doing more deliberately. We should continue doing them and be more deliberate in our focus. And so certainly the skills development. I mean, we saw that when we needed to suddenly reskill cabin crew to become medical technologists conducting swab tests, we could do that. So if we can do that in a hurry, let's look at how we might do that more deliberately. And certainly as we emphasize the development of the Singapore core, we should look at the skills training that's necessary and take that on in a more deliberate way. I think the other area where we might look to see continued funding and perhaps growing funding is in the Smart Nation strategy. So again, coming back to the technology piece. And we just held an event 2 days ago on smart cities and digital connectivity, and talked a bit about some of the government programs going on. Like IMDA has a collaboration with Capital Land, I think it is, on smart urban technologies. These are things that a lot of us have dove into in the last year, and the opportunity exists now to be more deliberate about that, and it'll be interesting to see how that comes out in the budget.
Very good. And I think that question covers something that is already on the virtual question. So I keep hearing the word more deliberate, more targeted, and not one size fits all. Yeah, but then we have another one here, because you guys ended with, we can retool, we can reskill, and we can all pivot, all right? But in light of all the uncertain recovery in Singapore right now, how do you think traditional businesses can consider pivoting to digital, while startup businesses are positioning themselves to also improve their resilience? So if I to reframe this, do you think traditional businesses can change? Because you tell us the new normal means embracing change. Any recommendations? I love it now when panelists stun.
We all go quiet.
Okay. Is this economics? No, it's not just pure economics. It's about any recommendations. You're all talking about smart nation, digital transformation. How do you see traditional businesses working with the ecosystem of startups?
One thing that I think businesses need to do very carefully, and this comes back to the deliberate idea, is identify how they want to work, define their working style, define their processes, and then look for the technology that supports that. As opposed to going out and buying all the latest and greatest and newest and shiniest stuff and then trying to change your processes to match the technology. That rarely works out very well. So when you take it on as a redesign of the business rather than just a redesign of the technology, that gives you a business focus. It's not change for the sake of change, it's change for growth. It's change to move into new markets. It gives you a business value underlying that change rather than just, ooh, that looks cool, let's get that. And that's what I think we need to avoid.
Or the government's funding it, so let's just use it. Okay,
that's right.
So
that's right.
Know yourself, know where you want to go. Marcus?
I think we have seen traditional businesses already adjust. I mean, food and beverage, our hawker centers now are on platforms where you can get delivery. You can do pre-ordering of food now on apps. You have government support for businesses such as art galleries who can now convert to e-commerce, have digital exhibitions. So I think it's not so much that if you're traditional, we label you traditional, there are no opportunities, as William said. I think it is looking at your supply chain and which areas can be made more efficient or allow you to access wider markets through use of technology tools. And really it is just applying the right tool for the job. Instead of a spade, let's use some other more efficient spade.
You want to add on?
Thinking what I can add to that. I mean, you're right. We've seen traditional businesses, banks, how they've gone extremely digital, so that will continue. What I would say is that with what happened in the stock market last year, one interesting aspect of the Singapore equity market is M&A. And we've seen that happen, and very strategic M&A also, not simply that I'm a beverage company and I can meet the needs of a larger one, but more companies that are heading the direction they know they need to. So they don't just try to throw money at the problem and try to digitize. They strategically partner with somebody who's in the same business, so the business grows at the same time while they adopt a ready-made platform as the companies merge.
Very nice.
So that we'll see more in 2021.
Perfect. And so it's complementarity. It's looking for the right strategic tools and partners in order to scale up. All right, and not just taking everybody's tool of the year. Okay.
Could I actually add? Could
Yes,
I just add one more thing to that? Because following up on that, in our event the other day on smart cities, one of our panelists was from a bank, and he had talked about how they originally viewed the fintech startups as their new competition a few years ago, and now the fintechs are their partners. And they've totally reframed their idea of their market. of the kinds of customers they can reach and how they can reach them, and in the process, they've changed that idea of competition. And find something more traditional than a bank. I think it would be hard, but you can make those changes, and you can be very successful doing it.
Very good, Will. So you talk about fintech and this question that just pops up. All of you, all three panelists seems to agree that US dollar is declining. So what's the alternative? Would renminbi be traded more and gain significance? And what about the magic word, all right, which I think we have Mark asking the question. Mark, come on.
Hi, I just want to build on the megatrend of digitization, and this time to digital payments. And I think you see this exponential interest in alternative currencies, cryptocurrency. We have the US regulators that actually approved stable coins just 2 days ago as part of digital payment. We have DBS setting up a digital exchange for cryptocurrency trading. So my question is this: are all cryptocurrencies the same, or are some more speculative than others? And should the investor be looking at this as the future trend? And if so, what should we be looking at?
Thank you, Mark. So I have a two-part question here. Online did ask what is an alternative to the dollar, since the dollar is forecasted as long-term declining. So could it be a renminbi, or could there be a crypto? I think I have to look at you for that, Tianyin.
It's okay, yes. We want to be very clear at one thing. With all the things we've said about the dollar weakening, structurally, it'll take a long time for US dollar to lose its safe haven status. As it is, I think 60% of all assets were denominated in the US dollar 5 years ago. Today, that's dropped to 50%. So it is falling. But the US dollar is still highly significant. What we will see is that another currency, euro, another major one, will probably be an alternative. CNH, renminbi for sure. But with capital controls, I think that the speed at which that happens might be a little muted. And what's interesting is that the dollar strength has been such a popular trade because of its carry when interest rates were higher for so long. We're going to also see unwinding of those hedges, which will make the dollar weaken further. Onto crypto, I have to say at JP Morgan Private Bank, as we manage portfolios, we consider risk, reward, and volatility in depth. At length. To answer your question, cryptocurrencies aren't all the same, and we've seen a disparity in their performance and the take-up. Its volatility, I suppose, would be what we, as a bank, would be concerned about when considering its role in a portfolio. So while it is important and we are reviewing it, I think the jury is still out on how it will play a role in long-term slow-growth portfolios.
We are not controlling her mic, all right? Yeah. Okay, so it depends on the role it plays from a global portfolio point of view. But what about tokenization, a utility token? Would that help the world build trade flows in a bigger way? Anybody wants to chip in on that?
Perhaps if I take a step back in the question and go back to what Mark, I think you mentioned, which was, are they all the same? Are some more speculative than others? I think we've lumped all these cryptocurrencies together, and by no means am I a cryptocurrency sort of observer or expert. But the question I keep going back to is fundamentally what real use do they have? And for a long time, the point was you have to think about, okay, the blockchain which cryptocurrencies are based on. There is a use there by which certain current cryptocurrencies, Ripple, for example, they've been used in situations where they can make trading or transfers of value more efficient. And if there is a fundamental use for some of these, then there may be some value there. There are others which perhaps the activity in transacting them far outstrips the fundamental use of them. And again, my own personal view, with the volatility you see in Bitcoin, that's probably because the fundamental use is not supporting a lot of the activity. So I think I'd go back to, when I think about these things, what is the underlying sort of use case for these things? And so is a tokenization of utilities or something else potentially going to be valuable? Well, if by having a decentralized permanent record through a blockchain is useful in that circumstance, then maybe. But I think it's difficult to think about all of them in the same way, because it's really very specific in terms of each cryptocurrency use case.
So I'm not going to belabor the crypto question. All right, we are right smack how many hours since the inauguration, all right, of Biden. And I think we could sense that optimism in the air, but you've also told us to be realistic. It's not go back to before, all right, in 2016, but we are very realistic. Can you tell us, with the change to the Joe Biden-Harris-Kamala administration, Mr. Lok Fook Singh wanted to know, what is the prospect of the unwinding of the supply chain decoupling in 2021? Okay.
So 2021 is going to be a year of great change among the U.S. administration. But in terms of when certain things are going to happen, I think a lot of the foreign policy and the foreign trade decisions may wait a little while. So the immediate priorities of the Biden administration are going to be controlling the coronavirus, rebuilding the economy, changing the immigration system, because that has gone through some issues in the last few years. Those are near the top. And if you look at, and I was making sure I checked the news right before coming in today, because just in case something happened, the White House announced the days on which Mr. Biden is going to take some executive actions. So these are actions that don't require Congress, but that simply the president himself can do. And he's got a number of days where he's going to focus on different things, and foreign policy comes in on February 1st. So that's a little farther down the road. And I realize that's only a week away, but my point is that there are other issues that are taking priority first. So while you are going to see changes in our approach to trade, it's not going to come right away. It's not going to come right away, yeah.
But you see, we have such a fantastic audience in the virtual world. Under a Biden administration, it would appear that even larger QE or money printing is coming soon. So to hedge the impact on Singapore's property, would you also recommend another round of cooling measures that should be implemented in Singapore? This is somebody waiting to buy a property. Okay, anybody wants to link the QE, all right, stimulus and impact on property? Can you give it a shot? Yeah.
Well, I want to make a mention about the new Biden administration. Well, I don't profess to be a political expert, but I will say this. From an investment point of view, that tail risk has been lifted. And what I mean by that, phase one is still in play, and the tariffs are still in play. But the worsening and unpredictable negative impact that the previous administration brought about to the US-China squabbles, that's been somewhat lifted. And that adds to the risk sentiment in the global recovery. So because of that,
you should buy everything and anything.
No, not at all. So that brings us to our next point, which is the decoupling. We mentioned so much about China domestic consumption. China is no longer just a factory of the world. It's one of the largest consumers. If you consider the US companies that are operating in the US, most of them, their activity is, they're tapping on the domestic demand. They're not manufacturing to bring back to the US. They're investing in Chinese subsidiaries. So those are all facts. So in terms of decoupling, I think it's already happened. It's made China develop even more fervently. It's semiconductors, it's healthcare, it's bio, it's immunology. So all that decoupling action won't derail. In terms of quantitative easing, I think we have to pay note that even though there's been a blue wave, never has there been such a narrow win by the Democrats since 1901. And what does that mean? It just means it's going to be so hard to get things through. 1.9 trillion sounds like a big number. They wanted 2.2, right? 2.3. I just think the 1.9 was supposed to look better, right? Just under 2. But the fact is that it's great because of the blue wave. Then we're going to see more of these clean energy, sustainability. But it's not going to be easy to get through, and 60 votes from Senate, or it's going to be a watered-down version. So the quantitative easing actually isn't as aggressive as we thought if it was a bigger sweep. As for cooling measures, this is very personal, but look, things are improving, and I think we've seen from the metrics that properties are being sold and it's turning up, but maybe not quite enough to justify cooling measures quite so soon. That's my view.
Yeah. Marcus, do you want to add on the property sector, and what do you think the, do you agree with Tie Nguyen that we don't really need cooling measures?
Perhaps I think, we're probably not at a stage where we're thinking about suppressing sort of particular asset markets. So nothing really to add. I think it's a wait and see.
Okay, very good. I have a couple more here, and I'm going to turn to my live audience, yeah? So live audience was happily sitting there, all right? So I need a question or two from you guys. But I think we have a question here, Tie Nguyen, that actually meant for you, but any one of you can chip in. May I know the thinking as to why the chance of price rising, which is inflation, is low compared to prices coming down, considering that freight is up, palm oil prices is up, steel prices is up. Why are you guys saying that inflation is not going to rear the ugly head?
Okay, I think,
first?
sure, I'll jump in. I think one reason that folks have been concerned about inflation is, certainly with all the stimulus money that's been pumped in to societies, there's a concern that this is going to get unleashed, that there's a pent-up demand, a pent-up consumer demand that is suddenly going to be opened up, and the products just aren't going to be there, and that's when you're going to see the price rises. But as we've seen, the recoveries are going to be bumpy. They're not going to be in a straight line. They're not going to be fast. And so the opening up of that consumer demand is going to be a bit slower. It's not going to be all at once. And that's one reason that we're not as concerned in our analysis about a potential for high inflation.
And Marcus?
No, I agree with that. I think we're seeing sort of consumer demand sort of probably come back, but come back slowly. Oil prices are still pretty low. So I think we're not seeing. I mean, there will be sectors where maybe supply chain effects or constraints will lead to higher prices. I think across the board though, and a continued sustained sort of increase in prices, maybe we shouldn't be too worried about inflation at this stage.
Kenny?
I mean, to be fair, it is a genuine concern. But yes, the reason why we're not concerned, there's so many reasons. If you look at the past decade, we've seen monetary easing like we've never seen before since the global financial crisis, and inflation didn't even budge. Now, we're not saying the past has to be repeated, but there was a lot of growth during that, and oil prices were higher, as you said, during that decade. Unfortunately, inflation is so stubborn. And with all this digitization that we're talking about, that can be deflationary. I mean, AI can boost labor productivity by as much as 40% in the next year, if adopted by double what I said. So that's deflationary. But when inflation does come up with a lot of fiscal spending, and it's going to depend how much fiscal spending they do, that will be cheered, not feared, because it's actually good to have a bit of inflation. And I look forward to the day that happens, but unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's anywhere very close. Yeah. And that's really looking at labor slack.
Okay, and now this one is from me, all right, not from the screen. Low yields, all right, and Tie Nguyen keep talking about it. So interest rates will stay low to flat, and the reasons is the sporadic growth and the bumpy growth. So what about leverage? Would you recommend that people borrow then, since interest rates is so low?
Is that for me then? I think so. Yes, for our clients, we do recommend taking advantage, not of the low rates, but of the improving fundamentals. I mean, household savings from all this stimulus has actually doubled in the past year. Corporates hold more cash than ever. And while they look to invest some of this, we look for modest amount of leverage to enhance yields. But it has to be very thoughtful.
And you got to know what you're getting into.
Yes.
Marcus, you want to jump in? I saw this. You're a treasury person.
Well, no, I'm not talking in that from that position right now. But I think the point being, if your balance sheet sort of if it makes sense for your balance sheet and you're doing something with it that makes sense for your business or for growth, I think that's what makes it something that you should be done. And I think the broader point is, debt isn't good or bad. It's not fundamentally good or bad. I think it's about whether or not you can manage the ongoing repayments and what you do with it to potentially lift your cash flows in the future.
Very good. I'm watching the clock. I have 15 minutes. Any burning question from the floor? Yes. Now you see everyone wants to have the microphone. Can we have a mic for Paul and then that gentleman over there? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm a pure net importer, so I'm ultra sensitive towards the currency movement. So over the last 1 year, I realized, and everybody's forecasting a weaker US dollar currently and then maybe in the foreseeable future. And how is it possible that, the euro and Swiss franc remain so high when the economy is actually getting out of shape, everything is not in order, freight coming in is expensive, and the cost of goods landed here is so expensive. And I also realized with all my partners in Europe, they are also not doing well. So when will there be any realignment of the currency strength, a weaker euro currency or Swiss franc, sterling pound? When can that be, any possible adjustment and realignment?
Thank you very much. I think Paul is going all the fundamentals point to a dollar weakening, all right, long term. And all these other currencies are so strong even though their fundamentals show that they are not doing so well. How come this big divide between fundamentals and currency movements?
Yeah, I echo that sentiment too. It feels very uncomfortable, especially when you look at Europe and their containment of the virus is much weaker than other countries, and their index is very less weighted to technology and healthcare than the US, which is why the US keeps outperforming the European, but that's on the companies. When it comes to currencies, we've realized that yields are a very, very strong factor. And I cannot stress enough about how, especially after this round of stimulus and lowering of the rates in March, US just lost any carry advantage. So Euro actually has a carry advantage over the US. Even if US hikes one more time, US is more negative, which means that just an investor expecting the US to weaken more or stay weak will look towards another currency, and Euro is a very obvious large currency that you can go into. Also the yen, but Euro is much more popular.
Yeah. So a lot of it is speculative.
It's
Paul.
on relative yield.
Yes, and people would borrow in a lower interest currency and invest in a higher interest currency. So the carry is positive when you keep doing this and then the currency strengthens because there's a demand for it. So unfortunately, fundamentals alone don't drive currencies. All right, but we have another question from that side of the floor. Can we bring a clean mic over there? Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question is about this cybersecurity in this transformation journey. How is our panel members look at this topic? Right? Is that a big risk or is equal to a big investment opportunities?
Anybody? Yeah. Start with Tian-Ning. All right.
It's a tremendous investment opportunity. As I mentioned, corporate America, 84% of them think they're not ready for the cyber risk that they think they know about because new ones come along all the way. At JP Morgan, we continue to spend a huge amount on cybersecurity because without that, how could you possibly work remotely? So if you had to choose a megatrend digital transformation, please consider companies that are at the forefront of cybersecurity. And that typically comes coupled with an artificial intelligence capability.
And Certainly, yeah. At our event the other day, we had a cybersecurity expert there, one of the cybersecurity chapter lead from SG Tech, the trade association here. And he made a point I thought was really good. He said, when we talk about cybersecurity, when we talk about data protection, when we talk about privacy, ultimately what we're all talking about is trust. And so as an organization, you have an immediate, maybe a short-term concern in terms of protecting your own data and protecting yourself from ransomware and challenges such as that. But you have a long-term concern in the relationship that you build with your clients, that you're building with your customers or your suppliers. They need to trust that you are taking this seriously. And so that's what some of these firms are really providing. It's not just the technology, but it's providing that sense of trust, and that's critical.
Very nice. So in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to try and cover 7 questions on the screen. Wow. And the reason is very simple. I have grouped them together for each of you. So I'm going to start with you, Will. Someone here is asking, how does Biden administration look at the energy market since he's more a green energy leaning president?
Yeah, he's definitely a green leaning president from a green leaning party. There is going to be a lot more interest in renewable energy from this new administration, in part just because that's something Mr. Biden, even as Vice President Biden, was interested in and was focused on, and the needs for that have gotten even greater in the last 4 years. But also he will feel some pressure from the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So when you come back to the fact that the Senate is split 50-50. The House has the lowest Democratic majority in a while. Mr. Biden has got to get all the Democrats on board with things, and one area where he can work with them and be happy about working with them is on renewable energy.
Good. And a follow-up question will be, with many of the European and US companies trying to be self-sufficient in production, will that lead to low demand for production from Southeast Asia? So the shifts in global supply chain that you were kind of alluding to, how would that shift look?
I think while countries are looking to maybe internalize a lot more of their production to bring it back home, one of the real advantages that Southeast Asia is going to bring is that RCEP. Because introducing a consistent rules-based system across the region, as opposed to a lot of bilateral free trade agreements, which may all look a bit different, is going to provide a sense of stability and continuity coming from here. Again, there's that coming back to trust, and I think having that solid rules-based system here is going to allow Southeast Asia to continue to be a strong contributor in many nations' supply chains.
Thank you very much, and I'm moving you to Marcus. Marcus, there seems to be this heavy buildup of government debt in many economies. What do you fear most about this massive buildup of debt?
I think the thing that we have to recognize is that many countries that have been impacted by lockdown will face fiscal pressure. Either it's from significant fiscal interventions that have come into play, or because economic activity has fallen away and revenues, government revenues have fallen off. But I think the thing to think about is when governments borrow, it's what they use it for. If we think back to just levels, I think that's too crude of a measure to think about whether or not it's fiscally sustainable. Back in the global financial crisis, over 10 years ago, we had the following that, we had the Greek sort of sovereign debt crisis. But if you look at Japanese debt to GDP ratios, they were way higher than they were in Greece. But no one questioned that. So what is it really that makes us question sustainability, right, of government fiscal balances, and that's whether or not we can have whether there's widespread enough trust in the fiscal and monetary institutions, and if we think about Singapore, some of that trust is engendered by its institutional settings. And what I mean by that is, for example, the government has its fiscal rule. The budget needs to be balanced over its term. If you can demonstrate responsibility against that, the market believes that responsibility, and it believes you can manage against that, then you can sustain debt levels that are higher. Particularly in this situation, we low borrowing costs, a need to invest and help stimulate the economy. I mean, we should be thinking about how best to use what it needs to use, rather than just thinking about high debt levels overall.
Very good. So
Can I
it's
add
not
to that?
absolute. You have to come in. I know, Tianyin.
No, I have to. On debt, yes, they're record high, but it's vital to consider what they're being used for. If what they're going to be used for is translating into GDP growth, then that's going to take care of itself. We're not being cavalier about debt. But you say it's high, but we also look at the cost to service that debt, which is at record lows. So that, I think, is an important factor to be considered. I mean, debt was so high after World War II, but look what that led to in the United States and looking at Will.
So very good. So don't look at one metrics because that doesn't tell you everything. And one more question you for Marcus. Continued financial support, we understand from government, cannot be sustained. But on the other hand, many SMEs are not going to make it without the support. So this is with the budget in mind, yeah? And transformation takes time. So what advice do you offer to SMEs? So this is a very realistic, good question. All right, maybe the government has its own plans, but what advice do you give to SMEs now for them to quickly transform, change, even though it takes time? What can they do together or with other bigger companies?
I think it's going to be quite a bespoke answer depending on what situation you're in. I mean, businesses that are facing sort of working capital constraints versus businesses that perhaps need to completely adjust, for example, the way that they do business. They need omni-channel presence, or they need to change their sort of production systems or whatnot. There's very different sort of set of prescriptions for that. But what I perhaps will say is, there hasn't been, there's a lot of existing support, and there has been support even prior to all these extraordinary amounts of support from the government to adjust, to change. Whether it's reskilling or whether it's creating your own e-commerce sort of e-commerce website or whatnot. There's a lot of things that the government's been trying to do for a long period of time to help do that. Now, I think that the difficulty with your question, I think, Prof. Ko, is change will take time, but how do you do it immediately? And I think it's going to be a matter of picking some of the things that will make sure that you address what are the key risks to your sustainability. Maybe it's making sure that you become more liquid, or making sure that you reduce costs, or accessing markets more quickly, or wider markets. So I think it's going to be a different prescription. I'm afraid I don't have a one size fits all answer.
That's perfect. Yeah, there's no one size fits all. So that's why consultants have jobs. Okay. All right. Now we go to you, Tianyin. Last part. All right. It's a very long question, but I'm going to shorten it a little bit. Your charts and all advocated that we should look at onshore Chinese bonds, given the high yields, But can a government like China and its bond issues be trusted? Do you think this is a really safe asset for a portfolio to capture upside in Asia?
Thank you for that easy question. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's completely safe. Well, no investment is. But it's considerably safer than what it used to be for a number of reasons. China has opened up tremendously over the past few years, and that's why other governments, like the Japanese government, have been buying Chinese government debt. It's still very under-owned, as I mentioned, and that's got implications. It's safe in the sense that I love the fact it's got low volatility because there's so little foreign ownership. We've seen what can happen to fixed income markets where there's a lot of foreign ownership. So when there's a problem in their own country, they pull out, and we've seen that happen with the Korean stock exchange some years ago when 1/4 is foreignly owned. But what happens, and then people say if it's not safe, then because they allow their companies to default. I feel that sometimes things are taken out of context. There were a couple of defaults that were announced in the last 6 months in China. One of them had the ability to pay and had a huge cash balance sheet. They're more idiosyncratic is what we're trying to say. And the Chinese government is actually retorted by having some strict measures to curb this willingness to pay. So does the Chinese government have to do some work to make sure that its issuers are willing to pay, yes. But is this a situation where you have very poor quality issuers that can't service their debt? No. So we think that 3%, you can build an investment grade portfolio in the Chinese renminbi market, and 3%, 3 to 4% higher than what you can get in the US for lower default rate. So yes, we are comfortable with that risk that we're taking.
But the liquidity side, you don't get to, get to sell it as quickly, right?
Well, yes and no. The bond market is ultimately an over-the-counter market. So there's this perception, in my view, I started out as a Treasury futures trader, there's a perception that bonds are as liquid as US Treasuries. They're not. You can go and ask the dealer for the price, but what we saw is that whatever's available in the market that anyone's quoting. So no, it's not quite an equity exchange. You could also have a bond with a massive issuance, say $2 billion. But if the majority of that is held by an institution, then only, say, 10% is available to trade in the market. I wouldn't say that's as liquid. But having addressed that, the Chinese bond market, yes, it's less liquid. It's a smaller size market than the US market, which is why it's so important to work with managers and the right institutions who know how to navigate that space. And when they choose bonds to put in your portfolio, they look at the liquidity, which is very important.
Very good. Except that not everyone can be a private banking client of JP Morgan.
Actually, these solutions are widely available beyond private banks.
And move on to the second last question. So what impact will US-China rivalry have on Singapore investments in China? This could be a real question, or it could Tierney or Marcus, anybody. Oh, I love it, when they stump again. This came from the audience.
No, this is us fighting to speak first, right?
Okay, all right. Which one I want to take it? Bill? So the rivalry, would Singapore benefit more from it? Or given now that there is this, risk-off factor in the Biden administration, what should be Singapore's approach?
So you're saying if there's a rivalry or there's a dissipation?
They say, what impact will US-China rivalry, which is not going to go away overnight, based on what Will has shared with us, what will this impact have on Singapore's investments in China? It's very vague, the question.
So there's a stream of thought which I agree with. When all these tensions started in 2018, that the decoupling started then. And China started to pay attention to more of its regional partners. Hence, Singapore, which is part of ASEAN, became its biggest trading partner. So we see actually opportunity for Singapore doing business in China. Domestic consumption, I don't think three of us can stress that enough. And that's nothing to do with the US. And that consumption will only grow. So with US doing business in China, the right type of business, I think it's a great opportunity.
And if I could add just one final thought, perhaps, on the impact of the US-China rivalry on countries like Singapore. The US is going to be looking for partnerships in approaching its competition with China. It is not necessarily going to come to countries and say, pick a side. We're a little more realistic than that. The U.S. government is a little more realistic than that. I'm not in the government anymore. But the U.S. government is a little more realistic than that. And coming to countries in Southeast Asia and saying, hey, it's us or China, is a non-starter. And that's not an approach we're going to take. So I don't want anyone to walk out feeling like, now we have to pick a new uniform and pick sides.
Very good. And I'm going to convert this last question, which was meant for Tianyin, to be a generic question where all of you will have that final word, yeah? So, Tianyin, you talk about harnessing megatrends. Many traditional business leaders are still struggling to understand that. So what would you say to them in a nutshell? All right. What does all this conversation that we have this morning, how do you give one good piece of advice to our business leaders in a nutshell?
I would say look at all the news that's out there, look at all these slides and everything we put up, and figure out what it is that's going to take your business forward and it's going to allow you to grow, and focus in on that. Don't get distracted by everything else that's out there, but find the things that are useful for you and be deliberate in your growth.
Very good. Be deliberate in your growth. All right. Don't get too distracted. Marcus?
I think the interesting thing is some of these will be what defines our new normal. And when we're saying that these will be the normal, it means they're no longer always going to be a competitive advantage. which means as a business, it's not so much, to do it now, you'll be ahead. It's if you don't do it, you might be behind.
For me, I just want to say, embrace it. This is a fantastic opportunity. In the past, if a Singapore company wanted to do business in the US, how many times a year would they have to travel there, wait in the waiting room, make known, convince them that they're good technology? With this digitization, with 5G, and now the companies will know about you before you even get there. It's so easy to connect and build your network. So embrace it. And I think we have a chance to see a lot more global companies out of Singapore.
The dreams and the vision is so clear. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we have a great panel here, a great audience participation, and I hear it loud and clear. Transformation, while it takes time, we need the 3 T's. I think we'll keep talking about trust, and Marcus keep talking about talent, and Tian-Yin keeps talking about tech. So guess what? Embrace the 3 T's, and as you journey out, happy transformation, everyone. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for a wonderful panel discussion. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Kelly. Right?
Thank you, Prof. Koh, and our speakers for the insightful panel discussion and Q&A. We hope that our participants have gained gems of wisdom and useful knowledge to forge ahead in 2021.
We have come to the end of the Annual Business Outlook Forum 2021. Thank you for your participation, and we hope that you have benefited a lot from the forum today. Please take some time to scan the QR code on the screen right now to fill out our feedback form. Your comments are very valuable to us so that we can improve our future events. We look forward to seeing you at the Annual Business Outlook Forum next year. So stay safe and healthy. Thank you and goodbye.